Welcome to the Podunk Polymath, a podcast dedicated to the sentiments of a secular, sarcastic, screwed-up Southernist JW and skeptic. I'm your host, Chris. Come on in. This is episode 17 of the Podunk Polymath Podcast. This week in the pre-ramble, wanted to mention a couple of things. Another black guy is shot in New Orleans. Apparently a running back. I don't know. I just know he's a football player, was for the Rough Riders, which is a Canadian football team, and he was killed by some white dude in a road rage incident, and the white guy was released on bail, pending further investigation. So it must be nice to be white, especially in the South, to be able to pull some shit like that. I guarantee you that shit would not happen if the races had been reversed in the situation. I can almost guarantee it, and he'd probably be dead. So once again, racism, yeah, it's not a post-racial society, people. We still got it going on. White people are allowed to get away with shit that they shouldn't be allowed to get away with. Institutional racism is so deep and ingrained in this country that I don't know what the fuck we're going to do to get rid of it. So we can't let this situation stand, and that's why there's protests and everything else still going on. We still got groups like BLM is more important than ever, standing up for racial justice, organizations like that. So if you can contribute or help or get together with these kind of organizations in your area, I would encourage you to do so, because this fight is ongoing, and it's not just that. There's so many others, but this is just a major one, the racial bias, to say the least. Also, I wanted to mention, of course, the East Tennessee wildfires that have burned a lot of people's out of their homes, and of course, beloved Gatlinburg. Many Tennesseans go there for their short little vacations. A lot of them got married there, probably in the little church there. So it's kind of sad and depressing, especially for people like me who grew up going there and who've enjoyed going there as an adult. And of course, a lot of people have lost their businesses, but also have lost their homes and their lives. So if you want to give, I would encourage you to do so. Dolly Parton has set up a fund where she's going to be giving $1,000 to each family who was affected until they're able to get back on their feet. So I'm going to put the link up for that. I forgot exactly the name of it. And also there is a couple of others. Remote Area Medical is an organization that helps out people who are in remote areas, obviously, and that especially applies in the mountainous areas out there in East Tennessee. So you can give to them directly online. You can donate through PayPal or other means. I'm going to put some links to places in the area. If you're in the area, East Tennessee area, you can actually give certain supplies to certain organizations that will distribute it. I personally encourage you not to give to the Red Cross just because of their questionable tactics in the past, especially concerning Hurricane Sandy. I mean, I'm not going to tell you not to. I mean, I don't, it might be different this time, but I'm just saying, try to give to local organizations because they're more likely to give it right to the people that need it. So look into that if you can. Every little bit helps, and keep these people in mind. It's horrible. It's being burned out of your home, and I want to go ahead and tell you that it's probably climate change that's helping this along, whether you like it or not. More shit like this is going to happen in the future. Extreme weather events that usually don't happen because of changing weather patterns. So, say what you want. I'm going with climate change on this one. On the palaver this week, I have somebody that I have been friends with on Facebook for a while. She is an activist and an author concerning disabled people, because she is one herself. And I think you'll find it very illuminating, very heartbreaking, but also very hopeful in a lot of ways too. It's a great story, and I think everybody should listen, and it should get out more, this kind of story. So stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Brewpubs have always been a place to sit back, have a few drinks with friends, and talk about everything under the sun. Skeptics Brewpub is just such a place. Each week, Brother Brewer invites people to come in and talk about politics, religion, skeptical inquiry, beer, geekdom, and whatever else happens to come up that night. You can join the conversation by chat each Monday night at 8:30 p.m. Central Time on Spreaker, or catch the show later on iTunes, Spreaker, Google Play, or any other podcatchers out there. That's Skeptics Brew Pub, where nothing is sacred and no conversation starts without a 2-drink minimum.
Robert and Tom combine to create the dynamic duo of obscure secular media. With their trusty sidekick and unpaid intern Kerry, Robert and Tom bring you secular news you may have missed.
Holy Twin Powers, activate!
Join us weekly for Tom's Yak to the Past or Robert's Mr. Potter Award, but stay for the yakking. You can find us at secularyakking.com or subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast feed of choice.
Welcome to another edition of the Palaver here on the Podunk Polymath Podcast. This week I have somebody that I'm actually really excited to have on, which isn't to say that I'm not excited for other people. Don't get that impression. But I've been following her for a little while, and she is somebody I really admire. She is a blogger, an activist, and the author of Young, Sick, and Invisible. May I introduce to you Ania Bula?
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm very flattered.
Well, no, I'm flattered, actually. I've been following you for a little while, and I will get into later how I got into following you and why I became interested in your work. But first of all, let's get down to who you are, what you do, and what you're all about.
All right. I got my start sort of in this whole area as a blogger. I write for Alyssa and Anya Splain You a Thing. It used to be called Scribbles and Rants. So we kind of evolved from Scribbles and Rants to Let's Splain You a Thing. And I write a lot about social justice issues, particularly those related to disability. And a couple years back, I wrote an article about Crohn's disease. And I was floored by the response that I ended up getting to that article. It got shared more than anything else I'd ever written. And I started getting people emailing me, thanking me for sharing my experiences. And that got me thinking. And I decided to sort of put feelers out there if people would be interested in a book. Because I always wanted to sort of be a writer. And at the time as well, I was just sort of in the process of applying for disability and everything. And I was trying to sort of focus on relaxing, but I hate being idle. So having a project always really helps me. And so I put some feelers out there and I got some interested feedback. So I decided to sit down and write Young, Sick, and Invisible, which is sort of my story of diagnosis. I have a bunch of different disabilities and illnesses, including actually more since the book has been written, which is kind of funny. That's a little bit about me, I guess. I studied science at the University of Ottawa. I was actually in biomedical sciences for 3 years before I had to switch to English because of my illnesses. I mainly wanted to go to medical school originally, but I realized that being on immunosuppressants and sometimes basically having issues with concentration related to inflammation meant that medical school was probably not a good idea. And so I moved on to English literature and sort of went from there.
Well, it looks like you've been able to kind of combine the two, so I guess that's good. First of all, your book. I've read the book, and it really moved me, and it really got to me in a couple of different ways. I guess, first off, it was ridiculously honest. I mean, I'm sitting there cringing for you, thinking about some of the stuff that you were talking about happening to you. You know, I mean, and it's things that I think people can identify with, and I think the honesty itself would strike people. It struck me, and it really allows people to identify as much as you can identify with somebody and not actually having the condition. So why don't you kind of give a brief idea of what conditions do you mind saying what conditions you have?
Not at all. So my whole process sort of started with psoriatic arthritis, which is very similar to rheumatoid arthritis in that it's an inflammation condition. It's autoimmune, and it stems from the same gene that causes psoriasis. 10% of people who have psoriasis can end up with psoriatic arthritis. And basically, I got the diagnosis before I really went into overdrive with it, but the way I went into overdrive made it seem like it might have been something else for a while. And so I went through, as you read in the book, a fairly long process of figuring out exactly what was going on. And during that entire process, I was in an extreme amount of pain and basically had very limited mobility. Like I had to use a cane, and even then I was basically dragging myself along with the cane rather than actually walking normally. And then at one point I even ended up in a wheelchair just because I couldn't support myself on my legs. They would just give out underneath me. Later on, I got diagnosed with Crohn's disease as well. For people who are unfamiliar with this condition, it's an autoimmune condition similar to arthritis, but it affects your digestive system and basically causes your digestive system to get pretty inflamed. And depending on where the inflammation takes place, can create a variety of different digestive symptoms, including basically frequent trips to the bathroom that are often painful, malnutrition, as well as sometimes being sick. I couldn't keep food down for several weeks. So that was a process as well to get diagnosed. Since then, actually, I've also found out that I also have fibromyalgia.
Oh, no.
Yeah, that's actually not uncommon for people with chronic pain conditions. From my understanding of it, when you experience chronic pain, basically the frequent pain reinforces a lot of the pain receptors and sort of pain nerves and can cause sort of excessive feedback along those lines, which then leads to interpreting, for example, the feelings on your skin as pain, and sort of like pain sensory overload.
Yeah, I'm not. Isn't fibromyalgia basically just sort of pain just for no real reason or something? I'm not real certain on what it is.
Yeah, it looks like they found a neurological basis for it, like a physical neurological basis for it. For a long time, people thought it was a psychological condition. This isn't actually helped by the fact that one of the treatments actually is antidepressants, but that's not because of the antidepressant capabilities, but because certain antidepressants have actually been found to reduce nerve pain. So, for example, tricyclics and Cymbalta are two of those that do that. And yeah, I mean, like I said, from my understanding of it, it's basically like every time you reinforce nerves, the signaling gets easier, it gets faster. And if you're doing that specifically with pain receptor nerves, then eventually even something as gentle as gentle touch can end up turning into pain. Actually, a lot of people I know with it will use medical marijuana for the pain. It helps. And there's some other treatments. I'm not familiar with all of them because I've just started being treated for it myself. I forgot to mention also the ankylosing spondylitis.
I'm sorry, say again?
Ankylosing spondylitis, right? It's a condition basically, again, like arthritis, but it hits your spine. Basically, the cartilage in between the spine vertebrae. Thank you. For whatever reason, I couldn't think of the word there for a second. The cartilage in between the vertebrae kind of wears down the way it does in arthritis and can actually cause parts of your spine to fuse together.
Oh my gosh. It never rains when it pours, I guess.
Right? And then, of course, they don't tell you that there's a whole lot of psychological conditions that come with being disabled. It's very common for people with disabilities to have depression.
Yeah.
Not even for the obvious reasons. For example, with Crohn's disease, one of the causes can actually just be that the low absorption leads to low absorption of vitamin D. Hilariously, you'd think that the solution would be to go out in the sun more, but for whatever reason, a lot of autoimmune disorders respond badly to sunlight, and you actually end up in more pain. So it's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
So let's kind of get into, I guess, your book a little bit. Do you want to kind of give you already gave a little bit of a kind of a brief synopsis, I guess, of the first part of the book. Do you want to kind of, is there anything you want to hit on specifically about it? I mean, you talk about your struggles in the beginning with people getting people to understand that you actually had a chronic condition.
Yeah, I find that chronic conditions tend to confuse a lot of people, including doctors, just because we, as people, don't really have a good grasp on things that don't end. Like trying to imagine forever, for example, is extremely difficult because you imagine that at some point there's going to be an ending point. With chronic pain, it's the same sort of thing. Like people have this assumption that eventually you will get better. But with chronic pain and chronic conditions, that's not necessarily the case. And so sometimes people have this tendency to want to blame you for that because it's like, well, clearly you're doing something wrong since you're not getting better. But it's not necessarily, well, I mean, it's not a choice. I'm not getting better on purpose. I'm not getting better because that's unfortunately the way it works with some chronic conditions and with some people.
So yeah, I was struck by I don't know the kind of shit you had to go through in order to get people to kind of give you the time of day and make believe you that something was actually going on that was serious.
So there's two major reasons why that happened, and the first one is my age. I mean, a lot of times people have this assumption that youth equals health, and to a certain extent that's true because, you know, between childhood and old age, our bodies are at their prime. The immune system responds better. That's why conditions that affect adults can be more severe when they affect children and seniors because they don't necessarily respond as well. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're immune from chronic conditions and pain and sickness. And so getting people, you know, to take it seriously that a 19 or an 18-year-old has arthritis, I mean, everybody's reaction is sort of to be like, no, that can't be. You're too young. It's not possible. The second reason, and this is the sort of more insidious one, has to do with the fact that I'm female and I'm perceived as female. And there is a massive amount of sexism within the medical industry, and there is a tendency to assume that women overreact pain. So the idea is that, you know, that I'm complaining about how much pain I'm in, but really it's a paper cut, you know? Although maybe that's a bad example because paper cuts are actually surprisingly painful. But, you know, it's that sort of idea that because some people perceive us to be the, shall we say, weaker sex, that there's a tendency for us to exaggerate, to be too emotional, to be too panicked, to be not rational. The problem with that is that it flies in the face of actually what we're finding more and more to be medically true, which is that if anything, women have a tendency to underrepresent their pain, in part actually because they are themselves gaslit into believing that they have a tendency to overreact. So every single person I know actually who's a woman with a disability will go through a period where she actually, or I should say a woman or socialized as female, because I know a lot of non-binary people who fall into this same pattern, mostly because even though they are non-binary, they are perceived by society to be female, and so the same sort of prejudices apply. But they have a tendency to be so convinced that they're exaggerating that they will actually ignore a lot of their pain by thinking that it can't be as bad as I think it is. I must be overreacting. And a lot of times will actually wonder whether they're even as disabled as they think they are.
Yeah, okay. What blows my mind about this whole thing is that guys are the whiniest people about pain. Whenever they're a little bit in pain, this is just obviously anecdotal. But,
Yeah.
I mean, and women they have children, for fuck's sake. You know, they squeeze, what do they say? Squeeze something the size
Size of a watermelon out of the size of a lemon.
Yeah, but you're sitting there going to tell me that, and they're in pain for many different reasons that we wouldn't even, men don't know about generally, and they don't care to know about in a lot of instances, you know, and I don't understand that whole idea of women complaining about pain. That's a patriarchal society kind of imposing itself, I think.
Yeah. It also sort of ties in to Victorian era thinking, actually, where different signs of mental health disorders, as well as different pain conditions, were ascribed to hysteria, which was believed to be seated in the uterus. And so sometimes the treatments for it were hilarious, ranging everything from being the reason the fucking machine / the vibrator were invented.
Yep.
To things like fumigation of the vagina.
Yeah, I've oh my God, there was a discussion about this on a thread that they were talking about the uterus like going around other organs. It's like it moved around or it rotated or some weird
wandering uterus.
yeah, so something like that. And one of the treatments was the doctor would actually masturbate his patient, to cure the hysteria, so-called hysteria.
Hilariously enough, given a lot of the weird sexual predilections of the Victorian era, I have to wonder whether this was really just the only way doctors could think of to get to masturbate patients. Or, sorry, I should phrase that as get to masturbate women rather than patients, because hopefully doctors aren't trying to think of ways to masturbate patients. Although, I mean, given a lot of the sex scandals we've seen, maybe that's not
well
the case.
Sometimes you have to think that some people enter certain professions for less than noble reasons. Let's just say that just because of
very diplomatic way of putting that. Well done.
Yeah, just for the access to. I mean, of course, that goes for the priesthood too. Of course, we won't get into that. That's a whole different story. But any profession like that you have unlimited access and kind of a power complex going on, you're always going to have those types kind of getting into that. Yeah. I think.
And I mean, I think any time when you ascribe a sort of unnatural authority to anybody, you're going to get even more cases of that. You see that a lot, for example, with police officers, where a lot of them, even if they go into the police force with good intentions, ultimately, most of them get corrupted into this way of thinking that they are somehow more worthy of respect, more worthy of being able to control people. And I don't think it's a coincidence that something like 60% of police officers turn out to be domestic abusers.
Is that true? I hadn't heard that statistic.
Did you not hear that? Yeah. I don't know if I have the percentage right. Like, it might be 68%, it might be something else, but I know it's higher than 50%, and I know that it's surprisingly high statistic. A significant majority of police officers beat their wives.
That doesn't surprise me at all, to be honest with you. I mean,
it all sort of comes into that whole power idea, right? I mean, it's people who seek power for power's sake.
Yeah, and like you said, there's always going to be that kind of, not all of them, obviously. There's always going to be that contingent of people that kind of get into it for that power, and that's just human nature, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to some extent we see that a lot with doctors. Like, again, even if they get into it for the right reasons, there's a tendency eventually to sort of take on this thinking that they are infallible, that even if they do fail, that they know more than the general population, that they're better than the general population. And there's a sort of moralizing to this idea that, they're healers, therefore they're good, and their patients are the sick people, and therefore they must have done something bad to be sick. And we don't necessarily consciously think of it that way, but we very much see that in the way society treats people with disabilities and people who have gone through tragedies. It's actually called the just world fallacy, and it's pretty inherent. It's why a lot of people will react, for example, to lung cancer, saying, well, you did this to yourself.
Yeah, because you mentioned that in the book, the just world fallacy, as being a reason some people just look at you and say, oh, you probably did something to deserve it or whatever, or you did something wrong. Why don't you kind of delve into that a little bit about what that's...
So the just world fallacy is basically this concept that that the world is ultimately just, and that people who go through bad things must have done something to deserve it, that there's a reason why everybody experiences the things that they do. It's why we get into that mentality of where we hear about cancer and we think, well, that could never happen to me. Or we hear about somebody being hurt and think, well, that couldn't happen to me. We so desperately want to believe that there's some way of controlling things that we have a tendency to ascribe blame even when blame doesn't make sense. And so in the case of disability, what happens is most people think that there's a reason why people who get sick got sick. That, they had to do something wrong in terms of, maybe their diet or their health, about whether they made sure to get all their vaccines or whatever. There's a lot of people who desperately look for reasons about why you must be the way you are, which ultimately translates to give me some reason why this couldn't happen to me so I can stop worrying. But what that ends up happening is we end up treating people with disabilities as if the fact that they're sick is somehow a moral failing. And so we don't necessarily see a problem with punishing people who are sick. The amount of people on disabilities who basically are living on the brink of starvation or on the brink of being homeless is ridiculously high. The amount of people with disabilities who face really dangerous situations. The sexual assault rate for people with disabilities is something like 80%.
I had no idea.
Yeah. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but part of it can do is because you're frequently surrounded by caregivers, and you may be relying a lot on caretakers. It can be because you're more helpless, because sometimes it can be easier to attract abusers because you are in a situation where society makes you feel as if you somehow deserve to be in pain, therefore you don't deserve to be happy. A lot of times we're told that we don't deserve relationships or whatever, so it's easier to settle for an abusive relationship thinking that that's what you deserve. In some cases, it's also just because society doesn't think we can be sexually assaulted, we can be raped. A lot of times people with disabilities will actually hear something along the lines of, well, you couldn't have been raped because nobody would want to sleep with you.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow.
This is actually something a lot of fat girls hear, too. You're too ugly to be raped.
Oh, my fucking... No. Just no.
Yeah.
No. That's disgusting to me. I mean, that's just the worst kind of... Wow. I don't even know what to say to that, to be honest with you. That's horrible. So this just world fallacy obviously has been a big problem, one of the things you've encountered. I kind of want to backtrack a little bit. You said early that you said you were gaslit, and I don't know that everybody knows what that means.
Oh, so gaslighting is a term referring to an abuse tactic where you're told that what you're feeling is wrong, that you deserve what you're going through. It's basically a way of changing thinking. So a lot of times, for example, gaslighters will tell you that you're remembering something wrong and that actually they didn't do this terrible thing that you're accusing them of. Or they might, purposefully try to make you question things about yourself and question things about how you remember things and whether, one popular thing, for example, for gaslighters is to say, oh, well, you have a tendency to overreact, or to say, well, you don't look sick, or you don't look like you're acting this way, or like this is a thing that you feel. Or they'll tell you that you're wrong to feel the way that you are. And eventually what it does is it creates this feeling of self-doubt where abuse victims have a very hard time trusting their own interpretations of things, trusting their own memories. And it makes it easier to basically be convinced that the feelings that you feel, that basically that what you know is going on that's wrong is actually just you misinterpreting things. It's a tactic. It's an abuse tactic is basically what it is. And it's based on a movie that had gaslighting in the name. And I believe gaslights were actually physically involved somehow as well. So one thing that people with disabilities in particular face in terms of gaslighting is being told that our pain isn't as real as we think, or that we must be wrong about how sick we are because we were fine the day before. So, for example, if you, every once in a while you'll have a better day and you're able to do more things, or you're able to force yourself to do more than you really should be able to do. And then people will use that to say, well, see, you're not as disabled as you say you are because you did this thing. And then you're like, okay, but I can't do this thing every day. I can only do it occasionally.
Yeah, I find that what you're kind of getting at a little bit, the idea that one day you can be perfectly fine and, be able to walk around or do whatever. And the next day you're like completely laid up and you can't move. And I mean, that just sounds horrible to me.
And the sad part is that there can be no way to predict it, right? You can be having a perfectly great week with everything going fantastically and then just one day wake up and not be able to get out of bed. And I mean, you can sometimes predict things that are going to cause it to get worse. So, for example, in my case, emotional turmoil and high levels of emotional stress tend to trigger my Crohn's symptoms. So, for example, I know if I get into a really emotional fight, say with my parents, that there's a really good chance that I'm going to be flaring like the next day. Very often, actually, when I've gone through really traumatic situations, I will get sick almost immediately. Actually, I will, have to go off somewhere so I can be sick because I that's just the way my body responds to it now, is stress equals more inflammation.
Well, I mean, this is nothing like that, obviously. But when I get stressed out, my stomach goes in knots. Anyway, I'm sure a lot of people, but it's not the same, obviously, because your condition, I mean, it's a lot worse. And I think, as you said in the book, a lot of people have a difficult time understanding what you're going through because they don't have anything to compare it to.
I mean, because in a real sense, I mean, there is no way to compare it to anything, right? I mean, how do you explain to someone what it's like to be in pain constantly? Because most people only ever experience the pain as the specific ouch factor, which is, the pain that happens in order to let you know that something's wrong. But what if something's constantly wrong? What do you do then? So. Yeah,
I mean, I've had pain, of course, most people have. I've had pain that's lasted for a little longer because I have back issues sometimes because I'm getting fucking old. And, it kind of lasts a while and then eventually get over it or whatever. Or there's like you in the book, you said, people get the flu and, they might have it for a while, but there's a beginning and an end, But for you, there really is no beginning or end. It's just is. And I have to wonder, I mean, I'm sure that, how do you cope with that? I mean, what is your coping mechanism for that?
Well, it takes a while to get there, I guess. I mean, a lot of us will go through sort of periods where we don't cope as well with it, where we do get more depressed about it and think, oh my God, is this what my life is going to be like for the next, 30, 40, 50, 60, however long I live years? Am I going to be in pain every single day of my life? And that can be really hard to face. One way I cope is not to necessarily focus so much on the pain, but try to focus on the good sides of my life. So, how much I enjoy writing, how much I love my wife, how, great my pets are, things of that nature, focus on the parts of my life that are going well as opposed to the shitty parts. And also it's, you can't really underestimate human beings' capability to get used to stuff. The kind of things that we as people can get used to is pretty incredible if you think about it. And I guess chronic pain is one of those things. Yeah, you're always in pain. Yeah, you feel it, you get upset and you can have moments where it's a little too much, but ultimately it just sort of becomes your reality and there's nothing you can do about it. So you just sort of accept it and move on. I mean, that seems kind of like a weirdly glib answer, but I mean,
it's realistic.
Really. I mean, it's realistic because, and it's sort of, there is no real coping mechanism so much as just moving on, I guess, because, I mean, otherwise, how do you cope with the fact that you're in pain constantly? One of the things a lot of us do is we learn to sort of ignore the pain, which ends up hilariously backfiring when you end up having to go to the hospital.
Relay that story you were talking about, your heart, like you were in the hospital.
Yeah, actually, this was for my wisdom teeth. I was getting my wisdom teeth out. And before the procedure, they have you hooked up to all the monitors. They're checking your blood pressure cuffs. They're doing all these different things. And we're just sitting there. But every once in a while, my heart rate monitor just suddenly, my heart rate goes up. My blood pressure goes up. My oxygen levels go a little bit down. But at the same time, I'm just continuing having this conversation with the nurses. We were joking around. We were just telling stories, whatever. And finally, one of the nurses just breaks in and says, what's going on? Like, why does your heart rate keep going up? You seem fine. And I'm like, oh, I'm just in pain. And they were like, what? And I'm like, yeah, sorry, I've been having reoccurring pain the entire time I've been here. It's just my Crohn's acting up. And they were just looking at me and they were like, if you hadn't been connected to the heart rate monitor, I wouldn't have been able to tell entirely that your blood pressure had gone up. I wouldn't have been able to tell that you were in pain at all. And I'm a professional nurse who's been doing this for years, who's trained to recognize those signs. And it was just that you get so good at ignoring it that you very much don't show it. But hilariously, what happens is that it backfires because you go to the hospital because you're in a greater amount of pain. But you're so used to dealing with it that you don't act how doctors expect you to act when you're in pain. And like, for example, I'm used to just being in a good mood, even when I'm in a lot of pain, that just because my pain level's at level 10 doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to crack the occasional joke, especially since, that's how I cope with things. I make jokes. But of course, the doctors are looking at it and they're thinking, well, clearly she can't be in as much pain as she says she is. She just wants drugs. So that ends up being kind of awkward. But the other thing, too, is I spend so much time ignoring pain that I devote a not insignificant portion of my mental energy towards not thinking about it. That sounds like a really weird way to phrase it, but ultimately that's what it is. You devote mental energy to not thinking about something. So then the nurse will come in and ask me what my pain level is, and I have to stop and I have to think about it, because I can't just tell you what my pain level is, because I have to tell you, because I have to take a moment and actually feel all my pain, because I've been actively trying not to. But then if you have to stop and think about how much pain that you're in, then it, again, kind of looks like you're not telling the truth. But it's not that. It's just that I spend so much time ignoring pain that it actually takes effort to remind myself to not ignore it.
Is there sufficient training in the medical? Well, I'm going to answer my own question. There probably isn't enough training in the medical field for people with chronic conditions.
Chronic conditions, but yes, but also just even chronic pain in general. In the sense that a lot of doctors know intellectually, that we're dealing with pain every day, but they don't necessarily think about what the emotional, psychological, and mental toll of all of that is. And so, they'll look at us and they'll see us not acting the way we're supposed to. And it jars with their sense of how it should be. Because if you're in pain, then you should be crying, you should be moaning, you should be upset, you should, be curled up in a certain way. And yeah, there are moments when I'll do that, but so much of my life is performing not being disabled that it's not something I turn off very easily.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know. I guess the idea for most people of being in what can be considered level 10 pain or whatever, and being able to crack a joke is just confounding, because I don't know that I could do the same. Well, I say that. It depends. I guess if you're used to dealing with pain on a regular basis, it's a different story than if you're just all of a sudden have a sudden pain that you're not used to.
Yeah. And I mean, it also comes down to personality as well. Like, I've always been somebody who reacts to horribly negative circumstances with humor. I mean, I remember when we got the news that my grandfather died when I was in high school. He died in a bit of a strange way, because he was riding his bike and he had a heart attack, which made him fall and hit his head, which gave him a stroke. And like, high school aged me, like, I couldn't help myself. I just kind of looked at my mom and I said, wow, talk about 3 strikes, you're out.
Oh, Lord. Okay. I'm sure that went over like a lead balloon.
Yeah, she was not amused, having just lost her father.
Yeah.
But, like, that's how I react to things. Like, every time something terrible happens, my reaction is just to laugh. I remember I used to be kind of a klutz, and I'd like fall down the stairs constantly. And I'd, get to the bottom and I couldn't breathe because I was laughing so hard at how ridiculous the situation was. So, I mean, for me, laughing in response to pain is just the most natural thing in the world. But yeah, for a lot of people, that's very much not the issue, or not the case. I remember one time when I got admitted for Crohn's, actually, I remember describing it to, I feel like I sat on a rusty knitting needle. The nurse thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, it's pretty funny, actually.
But I mean, it was the best way to describe my pain at that point. It's like, I feel like I sat on a rusty knitting needle. Like,
ooh, I don't even want to think about that now.
Yeah, Crohn's is special.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, Crohn's is a whole different thing. I mean, I have IBS and I have my own intestinal issues, and I've always had it. But I mean, that's completely different from what you're going through.
I have IBS too. That's what makes this even more fun. I have IBS and Crohn's disease.
Yes, that sounds horrible.
Because I needed both,
Yeah, I know. One wasn't enough, Let's just go for the overkill,
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I liked most about your book was the fact that you're willing to talk about just about anything, and that included you when you found out about your Crohn's disease, having accidents during class or whatever. And I just found that to be the detail with which you went into it, and not, I mean, it wasn't overkill or anything. It's just, it was very, what's the word? Matter of fact, I guess. I mean, make sure you bring change of underwear maybe, or, if you can, or of course, if you were to bring everything you really needed, you would have to have a whole fucking backpack, basically. I mean, what what is it about this? I guess that makes you, I guess, so honest and so being able to so forthright with people. I mean, you put out a book and you basically put it out there like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I was actually trying to think about this the other day, where I was trying to figure out, because I've always sort of had a tendency to be more open about certain things. And I mean, I think for me, a part of it was always, I knew there was other people going through the same thing. And I have a high tolerance for embarrassment. I have a high tolerance for what most people would consider shameful. And I knew that I was in a better position to talk about these things than a lot of other people. But I also knew that it was something that needed to be talked about, because it wasn't. Because there was people out there like me who were going through this thing that, we're constantly told by society that is incredibly shameful, and, that we should be ashamed. And, how many people do you know out there who make jokes about people being incompetent using diaper metaphors or, bathroom control? And for some of us, that's a reality of our lives, is that we don't necessarily have bathroom control. And trying to point out to people that, that's not necessarily correlated with competence is more important than we realize. There's also sort of the other side of thing where, again, it ties into that whole idea of humor, where I find humor in so many situations that even though it's something incredibly embarrassing happening to me, I can still sort of see the joke in it.
I find that extremely endearing, to be honest with you. I mean, just on a personal level, I think that's great. And I think you bring a unique kind of voice to that when you, in this book, you kind of, and I really enjoy that. And that's what makes it so, that's what made it for me so endearing, to say the word again, but it just, I could identify with it, because I'm like, we've all had things happen to us that we're not proud, that were embarrassing or whatever.
Yeah.
And you were able to kind of express that. And I think that was extremely helpful in getting people to understand what you're going through, even if they don't go through exactly the same level of it. They can understand, kind of the incidents that you're talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's the other thing is I think I wanted to give people sort of a sense, even if they couldn't live through it themselves, maybe they could sort of live through it through the written word. I mean, I know a lot of people tend to be very empathetic when they read. I'm not the only one who cried when Dumbledore died. Oh yeah, no, I was bawling. I just did a Canadian accent just there, didn't I?
That's fine. It's fine.
I slip into that from time to time.
Okay, as I said in the beginning, I wanted to kind of bring up the idea, one of the major things in your book that I already knew about and had been talking about was ableist language. And this is something that I had actually heard the first time I encountered you. I had heard you on something else, and you were speaking about ableist language. And it devolved into a bit of an argument, as I recall. And it kind of opened my eyes to the idea. So I read your article, or there's a couple articles you wrote about ableist language. And I even wrote my own humble blog piece about it before I had the podcast. And it's something that I think is important and not enough people take seriously. So what is ableist language exactly?
Well, I think first, a lot of people aren't actually familiar with the term ableist or ableism anyway. So ableism is to disability what racism is to race. It's basically the act of systemic discrimination against people with disabilities. And our society's inherent and systemic ableism is so deeply ingrained that a lot of times we don't even see something as being ableist or don't understand that it's ableist. And one of the ways that we see this, for example, has to do with how we define and how we understand intelligence. We have a very poor way of understanding intelligence in that we tend to define it specifically by academic standards. And what that ignores is that there are different types of intelligence. I mean, if you had someone, say, who could compose like Bach, but couldn't add 1 to 1, we would have a tendency to call them, not intelligent. And yet they can compose beautiful music. They have a type of intelligence that a lot of us don't have. And because we sort of have this tendency to define intelligence in a very black and white way, we also have a tendency to moralize it, which creates a sort of situation where, without even realizing it, we tend to disproportionately put down people with cognitive disability issues. And to a certain extent, actually, we do this with all disabled folk, where people have such a tendency to talk down to people who are disabled and just assume that they're cognitively impaired. I have a friend who's blind, for example, and very frequently has people talk to her as if she can't understand language.
I don't understand that. I have never understood that.
I think it sort of ties into this idea that, again, it's sort of that idea that disability is somehow a moral failing, but also a failing of intelligence, that we did something wrong in order to become this way. And the idea of intelligence and disability in general being a negative thing, lack of intelligence or cognitive disability. I shouldn't even say lack of intelligence, because I just mentioned that was a very improper way of looking at things. But the sort of idea that cognitive disability equals immorality is so ingrained that, like, for example, with this whole Trump election, a lot of people are talking about people who were cognitively disabled, or say, and I'm using scare quotes around this, stupid, being the reason that we voted for Trump. But that's not actually the case. There is no correlation between cognitive disability or intelligence or IQ levels with who voted for whom, because it's not a moral thing. And it's so deeply ingrained in us that there is this sort of morality in it, that words that refer to disability enter our lexicon as insults. And it's so ingrained that whereas other slurs are at least understood to be swears, the same can't be said for ableist slurs. So, for example, a lot of words like dumb, lame, stupid, things like that, things that are, references to different disabilities, are actually what we call sort of like the swearing light. It's the ones that we'd expect kids to use, or we'd use on kids' shows instead of, fuck or shit or crap or asshole or douchebag or any of these things.
Right.
I had my little fun getting to list off swear words just there. So we have this sort of thing where, going up to someone and calling them a slur like the F word or the N word, we understand as inherently bad, although perhaps less so in light of recent politics.
Tell me about it.
We don't necessarily see the same thing of applying the same label using an ableist slur. And the reason for it is because as a society, we still do see something wrong with people being disabled. It goes into that sort of idea that disability equals bad. And so it's really hard to convince people that that's not the case. Inherently, most people think that disability is misery. And it's not. In fact, most of the stuff that causes misery are actually the results of inherent ableism in our society, which is sort of hilarious. Most often than not, the biggest cause of misery in disabled people's lives are abled people. And I mean, it's like, if you look at it, for example, we have an incredible amount of technology at our disposal. Tweaking some of this technology to become accessibility devices would be some of the easiest things. And yet, we don't have a lot of people looking into it because it's just not a cultural priority. Integrating people with different disabilities into society is not a social priority. And it goes to the point where some people don't even think that ableism is a thing or that disability justice is a thing. We've actually, and I say we because I'm sort of thinking of other disability activists right now, a lot of us have dealt with having to convince people that no, actually discrimination against people with disabilities is very much a thing that exists in the society. And a lot of people have a really hard time seeing that.
Yes.
And it's not even people who are sort of opposed to social justice. I've had people who have spent hours arguing about the damaging impact of gendered slurs. So, for example, the tendency to use what is improperly understood to be female anatomy, because that's a cis-sexist approach. So, for example, calling somebody a pussy, well, that creates a culture in which we inherently think that there's something wrong with the vagina. The fact that penis isn't a swear word, but vagina is. The fact that we have jokes about the smell of vulvas and vaginas. things of that nature. There is a sexist impact of those kinds of slurs. And I've seen people who argue that and who are actually in favor of changing how we use language in order to reduce the impact of that, then go on to say that the same isn't true for disability slurs because it's never been a problem for them. But then they've also never dealt with cognitive disability, so it wouldn't be a problem for them. But if you're sort of the person with ADHD or with another learning disability being told by teachers or being told by parents or being told by society that you're stupid constantly, you can see the impact that it has pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it. It doesn't affect you. It doesn't affect people. For the reason why they don't really pay attention to it as much as they would any other thing.
There's also the fact that a lot of people don't even realize how it affects them when it does. The way people try really, really hard, for example, to make it obvious that they themselves, they don't have a disability. One thing, or, that they're not cognitively disabled. Oh, well, I'm not stupid. The way we get so angry at the possibility that somebody could think of that. The way we insult people by implying, that they're crazy or stupid or something else, in order to show moral failing. It can have an impact on you without you even realizing it. Just the way that you try really, really hard not to show your mental health issue so that nobody thinks you're crazy. Or, you try really hard not to talk about silly things because you don't want somebody to think that you're stupid. And I'm using these words right now, but I'm using them demonstratively. I'm saying that you shouldn't necessarily use those words. And a lot of times these words aren't actually even as precise as people think. One of the biggest arguments against changing their language is often that they're like, well, I want to be exact about what I say. Well, okay, but if you're saying that something's crazy, you're not being exact unless you specifically mean that it has a mental health issue, which, that movie was so crazy. That movie was so mentally ill.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
Yeah. What a lot of times people want to say, oh my God, that movie was so fast paced. That movie moved around from one issue to the other. It was hard to keep track, but that made it, impactful in its way. It was ridiculous. It was, worthy of ridicule, that kind of stuff. A lot of times you can actually be more precise with language and explain what you mean a lot better without actually using any kind of ableist language.
Exactly. And I've been guilty of this. I just can't think of what I want to say at the time, so I try to think of a shortcut. And of course, it's imprecise, but I'm trying to evoke this emotion in the other person. Mm-hmm. Of course, the fact that you're having to use that word to evoke that feeling in the other person says right there, well, we have a problem with ableism. Because crazy evokes that kind of, oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't.
Exactly. It's, the fact that that is the word that you use to evoke that emotional response just goes to show that emotional response exists with regards to that idea. It's the same reason that we understand that using gay to mean a pejorative is a bad thing.
Yes, and I tried to use that argument before. That's the one I go to because I've had these discussions with people. And you're right, people get really upset when you suggest this to them. Like, that's not the same thing. You can use the same examples for racism or, sexism, and then try to apply it to ableism, and they just can't make that connection.
Yeah. And there's three sort of major reasons for that. And one of them is it's really hard. We all want to believe that we're the good guys. We are better than... It's a human instinct. We want to think that we're better than the next person. So then to turn around and be told that actually you've been participating in the systemic oppression of a group of people all your life just by existing can be really hard to face because you're thinking, well, no, I don't want to be a bad guy. And the truth is no, you're not a bad guy, but you are also participating in this oppression and you need to be a good guy. I don't even know if that was entirely clear, but,
no, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So that's the first thing is it's really hard to sort of face up to the fact that you might have been playing a role and not an insignificant role in perpetuating oppression. The second one is, like you said, it's difficult. It's extremely difficult to change your language. Even though I myself am an activist for these things and I'm, talking about the need to eliminate ableist language, I grew up in the society too. A lot of times those are words that my brain reaches for first as well. And that's, because that's the world we grew up in. That's the language that we were taught as children. And making that change, actively being aware of that change is extremely difficult. But it also has extreme rewards, because even, let's say for a moment that it didn't have an impact. Forcing yourself to stop and think about those words and how they play a role in what you think and what you say forces you to think about your internalized prejudices, which in turn forces you to think about your privilege and leads you to think more about how these different oppressions play within our society. So even if it wasn't a case of those words having an impact, which they do, it's worth doing simply because it forces you to think about ableism.
Right. But the problem is some people don't want to think about that.
Yeah. And then the reason number 3 is because, again, it ties into that whole idea of you can't be discriminating against something if it's already miserable. So the idea is sort of like, well, disability is a bad thing, so you can't be discriminating against disability because by calling it a bad thing, you're just being honest. But the problem is that, one, in a lot of cases, the disability itself isn't necessarily the bad thing. The lack of accessibility is. And in other cases as well, okay, but disability isn't the same as disabled person. And a disabled person shouldn't be treated and shouldn't be forced to deal with oppression simply because they might be dealing with something that's in itself potentially negative.
That's an interesting way to think about it.
Even if we, and I mean, yes, is my Crohn's unpleasant? Yes. But that doesn't mean that I'm unpleasant. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. And every time I get treated as though I'm a manifestation of my disease, it actually makes my life harder.
It's a lot to think about, and I think a lot of people just don't think about it, to be honest with you. I think it's too difficult. They try. I think some people genuinely try to, but it's just difficult to overcome the idea that you're doing something that, you're, like you said, you're one of the good guys. But, in this instance, nobody likes to be told they're doing something wrong. I think that's part of it.
Yeah. And nobody, and I mean, it's the same way, that when we as white people hear from people of color that we participate in systemic oppression, it's hard to face that because in a lot of cases, you might really believe, but I actually do believe that racism shouldn't exist. I really do believe, that everybody should be equal. How can I be, participating in this if I truly believe that? Well, you can be participating in it because that's a society you grew up in, and you grew up with social structures that are in and of themselves a part of this oppression. And, it's about rooting out how these different systems play a role. And the amount of stuff that you can do completely unconsciously is amazing.
I know.
And, you end up, and, there's sort of that joke about white people guilt. And I mean, it is a thing, when you hear about all the terrible things that keep happening to people of color, as a white person, you're sitting there and you're thinking like, oh my God, I hate white people. I wish we couldn't do these things. How can we fix this? And it can feel like this huge, overwhelming thing, because how can I as one person, fix the system of racism? And then the answer is by making these changes within your own life, by encouraging people around you to make those changes, by speaking up about the issue, by being aware of it, and by making sure that when you raise your kids, you raise them to dismantle these ideas and maybe not hold these same internalized biases.
Good idea. That's excellent advice. As a last thing, I wanted to ask you, you said in your book, what can abled people do to make, things easier for disabled people? I
mean, a major thing is making accessibility more of a priority. A lot of times people don't even realize how they play into sort of the system. If we demanded more accessibility from our society, we would get it, but we need to have more voices than just the voices of the disabled, who are often ignored anyway. We need to hear from people who are the CEOs, who are the entry-level clerks, who are, the different positions within the government, and talk about the importance of creating different systems of accessibility. Like one thing that a lot of people might not even think about, but is a surprisingly serious issue. Supermarkets. They frequently change their display systems in order to force people to walk through the store more so they buy more. Reasonable marketing decision, sure, annoying, yes, for those of us who are shopping. But for someone who is blind, they probably have spent, hours memorizing the layout of that store, and all of a sudden it's different again. It's these little things like that on the surface, they seem so small, but if we stop and think about, okay, if I do this, how is it going to impact the vulnerable people in my society? encouraging, say, more things to be closed captioned, encouraging more people to hire interpreters so that they can, translate into whatever the most predominant sign language of that area is. Teaching sign language in schools. One thing that I find really frustrating is that the only time we ever expect kids to learn it is if they're personally connected to somebody who is themselves deaf. But I think, teaching children in schools to talk sign language would be a great issue. It could even reduce, say, the number of noise in classrooms, because if kids want to communicate, they can just sign at each other across the room.
Yeah, but the teachers wouldn't know what they were saying then, maybe.
Maybe the teacher should learn sign language, too.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. And you break up, I'd rather have learned sign language than a language you're never going to, like I took French. When the hell am I going to speak French? I love the language. I mean, I don't live in Canada, obviously.
There are actually a lot of places in the world that speak, sorry, I say that as a defense because I'm actually a big proponent of learning multiple languages, speaking 3 myself.
Oh, well, I did not know that.
Well, I mean, to be fair, my parents were Polish immigrants when I was born. So we spoke Polish at home, and all of their friends were Polish. So for like the first 5 years of my life, I was actually pretty convinced that Polish was the national language of Canada. And I was really confused about why the TV spoke a different language than everybody else. But I learned the TV's language eventually, so it was okay. And then I learned that the TV's language was English. And my parents decided to send me to a French school, since that's an option here in Canada, because they figured with every area around us being Anglophone, I'd pick up English on my own. And by having that extra education in French, I'd have extra languages. And I can say they've all come in really handy.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I love the French language. I didn't get to use it very much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I also have to say that the way we teach languages in a lot of schools is abysmal. When I switched to an English school and I sat in on some of the French classes, I remember sitting there being like, are you kidding me? Are you seriously learning how to conjugate this verb in grade 5? Like, this is grade 1 stuff.
Oh, I was like, oh, yeah, you'd have to learn it really early on for it to take root.
Well, and I mean, in a lot of cases, too, they just tend to reteach the same thing from year to year, so nobody ever actually gets a language basis. In reality, one of the best ways to teach kids languages is just to toss them into an immersion situation, and eventually they'll pick it up. Children have an amazing capacity for picking up language.
Oh, yeah, I know. I've heard that lots of times. The young brain is very absorbent. It's like a sponge.
It's because we're still building a lot of the neural pathways. So, I mean, it basically comes down to the more you reinforce certain neural pathways, the easier it'll be when you get older. When you're young, it's a lot easier to mold those pathways. And so, you can train the language parts of your brains to make more connections and therefore, make it easier to learn languages.
Indeed. So is there anything, I mean, as people, as just normal people, I guess one of the things you would say would be just don't talk down to disabled people in general, I would think. Just treat them as human beings.
Don't talk down. Think about inclusivity more in a lot of events that you do or you plan. Demand it of organizations like more. It's important for people, for example, to start requesting that they not hold events in places that have stairs. Keeping an awareness of how to include more people with disabilities into their communities. Petitioning for a basic minimum income, hilariously enough, can make a huge impact. A lot of people with disabilities are living below the poverty line and actually in extremely dire straits. Not only that, but being disabled itself is expensive. You need access to medication, you need access to accessibility devices. In some cases, you need service dogs, which can cost several $1,000s. And in a lot of cases, these things aren't covered. I'm in a situation right now where my mobility has taken a massive decline because of I've been in and out of hospital for this year and for the last couple of years, which has put me on steroids. And some of the steroids that I'm taking actually causes you to lose a lot of your muscle mass. And I've had some issues where I can't necessarily get around my neighborhood as easily because I can't walk very far. So if I can't drive there, I can't really go there. And I would benefit greatly from having a mobility scooter. I can't afford one.
Really? You can't get one of those you're not. Well, here, they were everybody. I remember my grandparents got them. They never used it just because Medicare was giving them out.
I'm still looking into it, so maybe there's a possibility somewhere. But I mean, for people who are seniors, it's easier. But when you're my age, I mean, people will be like, you don't need a mobility scooter. Or the assumption is that I need one because I'm overweight. Nobody stops to think that maybe I'm overweight because I've been on steroids for like on and off for the last 10 years.
That's a prejudice right there. And being overweight is a different prejudice.
Yeah. And it's amazing how, like, when you live with mobility disabilities, first of all, it can be really hard to exercise because there's a lot of things you can't do. I've been told by doctors I'm not allowed to run. I can't physically move my leg well enough to be able to ride a normal bike. I go swimming every week, but on the other side of things, I'm also put on a lot of medication whose side effect is weight gain. And like, especially prednisone, it's amazing. Like, it actually reorganizes the fat in your face and turns your face into a circle, which they call moon face. Look like a full moon.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, it's cutely poetic, but yeah, it's.
Not if you don't want it to look like a moon.
I don't particularly want to look like a moon, but okay. It can sometimes also cause you to have like a bit of a they call it a buffalo hump, because for whatever reason it just causes the fat to accumulate right at the top of your neck.
That is a horrible way to put it. I'm just going to tell you right now. Buffalo hump. I guess it's better than calling it a Quasimodo hump or something.
Yeah. And it causes you to gain weight, but worse, it can actually sometimes convert your muscle into white fat, which is the hardest one to lose. So not only are you gaining weight, but you're gaining specifically the kind of weight that's nearly impossible to lose. Then you can't necessarily exercise as intensely as you normally would because of your mobility issues. So it's this horrible positive feedback loop, right? Where they keep putting you on meds that makes it harder for you to that makes you gain weight, but then also makes it harder for you to lose that weight in the long run. And, so here I am overweight, but I eat healthier than most people who are half my size.
That's got to be fucking infuriating. I mean, that's just got to be just frustrating as shit. When you're trying your best to eat healthy and do all the right things as much as you can within your limits, and things seem to get worse, And
I mean, it's hard enough, sort of dealing with the body image issues that come along with it. But then, when I have to use a scooter at a store and I get all these looks from people where they're like, oh, look at the fat girl using because she won't walk. Or if I have to take an elevator because I can't bend my leg well enough to be able to comfortably take the stairs. Oh, look at the fat girl taking the elevator.
I'm going to be honest with you. I've been guilty of that on occasion. And I know it's horrible, and I've done it before, and I hate myself because some guy in an elevator actually did that because some lady took the elevator a floor down, and he's like complaining about it. He's a guy, and she's like, "What? My knees are fucked up." Damn, she didn't say it like that, but basically that's what she said.
Yeah,
and I was like, man, I was gonna be mad, but I was like, I've thought the same thing, and I feel like shit about it. And there are these jokes, you've seen them, especially here in the South, with these fat rednecks eating shitty food or whatever, and redneck and fat, they're both bad words to use, but I mean, and you see these memes with like the huge woman in a scooter trying to reach for food or something, and the scooter tips over. Ha ha, it's so funny. Well, no, it's not really funny at all. It's pretty depressing. It's pretty pathetic that you're making fun of that,
Yeah.
I think some of us have a tendency to do that sometimes, and it's not right, and I feel shitty when on the occasions I've done it. I've thought that way briefly. I'm like, oh, what the hell is wrong with me,
Again, that's such an internalized privilege. We're basically trained to think that way, and essentially we have to train ourselves to not think that way.
Yeah, basically. And it's difficult, even for the most well-meaning of people. Sometimes we all mess up, I think.
Heck, it's difficult even for people who are themselves fat. Like, the number of people who are overweight, myself included, who will catch themselves, dipping into fat shaming is kind of impressive. But that's, again, it's our society. It's how we're raised. It's how we're trained to think constantly with images on TV, with memes, with everything. And it's really hard to basically pick apart that social upbringing.
Exactly.
And what I find really entertaining is a lot of times atheists will talk about this issue with regards to Christianity and understanding how deeply ingrained Christianity is in a lot of our thinking, but then at the same time can't necessarily see how that follows that those same kinds of influences, are affecting them with regards to gender, with regards to race, with regards to ability, with regards to sexual orientation, with regards to gender identity, to all of these different things. Like, for whatever reason, they can understand the social influence of religion, but they can't seem to understand the social influence of all these other things.
Oh, I'm not surprised at all about that, to be honest with you. That's just human nature.
Yeah, I find it amazing when people can't necessarily see how the same thing they've been arguing about just follows through to the other conclusions. And it's just, I mean, I'm guilty of that too, but I mean, I try to do better, I guess.
I think that's about anybody can do is try to do better, to be honest. I think that's just for anything.
Yeah.
Just try to be better. And don't just say you're going to try, to actually actively try. And a lot of that stuff is internal and nobody will ever see it. But you're doing it for yourself, your own self-worth, your own self-enhancement.
Yeah. I don't remember where I read this, but somebody was talking about how they feel really bad, how they'll catch themselves sort of having that thought, where you might look over at something and you have the prejudiced thought, but then immediately afterwards you call yourself in your own head and fix it.
Exactly. Right.
And
right. That's what
the person said that their grandmother used to say that the first thought you have is the society you grew up in. Your second thought is who you are.
That about nails it. Yeah. Grandmas are always pretty wise, I found.
Except when they vote for Trump.
Well, that's a whole different.
Can you tell I'm not a fan?
Yeah, I don't think most people who are listening to this podcast are going to be big fans. All right, Anya. I guess we'll wrap thing. I kept you long enough. I just wanted to, in closing, I like I said before, I really enjoyed your book, and not just because you made me read it for the podcast, but because it really was enthralling. It really sucked me in. At first I was like, okay, I got to read this. Not really. I mean, I'm not really like that, not totally or anything, but because I like to read. But it really did suck me in. It really, I guess, grabbed me. Like I said, the honesty and the hopelessness that I felt, but also the hope as well at the end. I mean, things go on, life goes on, and we all have to just live with what we got. And that goes for anybody, even if you have a condition such as yours or multiple conditions, we just have to move on and live. And not to mention your writing, which I've read your blog before, of course. Well, you and Alyssa's blog. I've always liked your writing anyway. So, and the story itself was dare I say, uplifting. And I think you're not as invisible anymore because you put it out there. And hopefully people will make you more visible, make disabled people more visible with what you wrote.
Thank you. And yeah, that's my hope. And if nothing else, the number of people who've reached out to me since the book has been published, just to say, how much it meant to them or how it helped them feel less alone has been reward enough. I mean, I can't tell you how often, like, I'll come to my inbox and I'll find one of these messages and I'm just in tears by the end of it.
Yeah, I can imagine. You've helped a lot of people. All right, why don't you tell people where they can find your work?
Okay, well, you can find my blogging at the Orbit Network. The blog's called Alyssa and Ania Explain You a Thing. I believe you mentioned you'd include a link in the comments or in the description. And you can find my book on Amazon. It should also be available at least through the online catalog of a lot of major bookstores. And if you do buy through a bookstore, when you go in, if you go in basically to buy through their catalog, you can ask them to hold physical copies of the book actually in store as well. I know a couple of stores here in Ottawa have started doing that, so that's great.
I wonder if libraries will do that, because I know my Library Overdrive collection will let you select, ask for books, certain books, if they don't have it in their collection.
Most libraries will let you request something. I actually just submitted my book to our local library to see if they'd be interested in it.
Yeah, so if you're able to do that, anything to help get the word out, because I think this book is hugely important.
Thank you.
And I think a lot more people need to read it, and people need to buy it for Christmas, for gifts, for Christmas, for gifts. Everybody hear that? Go buy this book for a gift for Christmas. Anyway.
Thank you.
Anyway, well, Anya, I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Same here.
I really appreciate you coming on. Like I said, I've admired you for a while, so.
Thank you. It's nice to hear.
All right, Anya. Well, you take it easy, and hopefully I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much, and talk to you again soon.
That'll do it for this episode of the Podunk Polymath Podcast. I want to thank Ania Bula for coming on and speaking to me about a subject that not many people know about, but needs to get out more. Disabled rights and ableism, and what us able people can do to help. If you want to come check out the show, my website is thepodunkpolymath.com. You can find me on the usual locations, of course, which is Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher. You can subscribe to the RSS feed. All of these buttons are on the About page, well, on the side page for the main page. Everywhere, it doesn't matter. Also on the page is a donate button. You can follow me on Twitter, follow the tweets. Of course, you can also become a patron, part of the posse. If you so choose, there's a button for that as well. There's also recent posts and recent comments. Of course, if you want to find the show on social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Google+, just look for the Podunk Polymath. If you want to email my podunk.polymath@gmail.com. There's a call-in number, 615-378-POPO-POPO, 7676, which also means freedom. You're fighting for freedom when you call in. Just remember that. Of course, you can follow the page on WordPress. There's a follow me button for that. And of course, the music is by ... You can check out their music, cdbaby.com/cd/... Of course, you can go to their Facebook page. The link is on the page, on the About page. I'm not going to reiterate it because it's ridiculously long. I want to thank everybody for listening. I wanted to mention also that this last week was the second most downloads I've had in a week since the inaugural week. Largely thanks to Tucker Drake coming on to my show. His episode really helped me out. Apparently he's more popular than I thought. So thanks Tucker and the Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast for coming on. I'm probably have him on again, and I'll probably be on his show trying to get through the Apocrypha. So look for me on there. Of course, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I put out a new promo, and it's already been played on Tucker's show, The Atheist in the Trailer Park. Also, Secular Yakking. I know Cass from Everyone's Agnostic said he was going to play it. There's probably a couple others I'm forgetting off the top of my head. There's no telling where it's going to pop up because I put it on the page where all the other atheist and skeptic podcasters are, so it might pop up other places and I won't know it. So, as I said, if you hear it, let me know where you heard it so I can thank him if I don't hear it myself. So anyway, thanks again for listening, and y'all take it easy now, okay?